Hi, I'm Chris Nesladek, and I'm an interaction designer working on the Android project. Today, I'm happy to be here to present to you Pixel Perfect Code, how to marry interaction and visual design the Android way. Now, the goal of this talk, which is a first-of-its-kind exploration, so you guys are the guinea pigs, is to expose you to the tons of the framework elements that we've built into the system so that you can hopefully build richer user experiences. As a side note as well, several of the examples that I will demo today were created out of an emulator which shows a cursor. The cursor is meant to indicate touch. To set the stage for you, so to speak, the talk is going to focus on the three pillars of interaction design that we've modeled Android around: structure, behavior, and expression. We're going to talk at a strategic level first about what makes Android unique. So as you start to develop and design applications for the platform, you should think about these key things that I will highlight. I will also then step back and expose some of the basics that are part of our framework. Then we're going to dive into the behavior layer. And behavior is how we bring structure to life in Android. We'll cap off with probably what will be an interesting exploration. That would be, we'll talk about expression. That's generally where you need to focus a lot of your energy, but it often gets overlooked. And hopefully, if I don't talk too fast, actually, if I talk fast, you'll have plenty of time for questions. So we'll handle those as well. Now, as I mentioned, and if anyone's seen my trailer video, the Android user experience is based upon the principles of interaction design. And these principles, there's three pillars of them, are structure, behavior, and expression. If any of you know a little bit about the history of interaction design, what this means is its roots are grounded in architecture. So if I were to give you an example of an architect, which I'm going to, we could look at how you should start to think about these three pillars. An architect, when he or she first starts the process of designing a building, well, he or she lays down a blueprint. And on that blueprint are certain predefined structural elements that need to go into place for that building. For example, there's going to be floors. At some point, there's going to be doors. There's going to be elevators. There's probably going to be things like light switches as well, plumbing. This is all basic structural elements. After that, the architect will then jump into the next pillar, and that's the behavior pillar. And what that means is, wherever he or she has decided to place these elements, like doors or elevators or light switches, he or she, as the architect, is starting to think about how they're going to behave when a user enters the room. For example, with a light switch, are there going to be motion sensors that trigger the light on or off? Is it just going to be a press and hold type of thing that turns that light switch on? So structure and behavior come together in the final pillar, which is expression. At this point, the architect, probably working with an interior designer or someone like that, has decided that, how that light switch behaves, could be a slider or it could be a button, as I mentioned, that kind of has to have an expression so that when someone enters the room, they know how to turn that thing on. So that's, at a high level, a good way to start to think about how we think as designers on Android when we build applications. Now, as I told you, we're going to go from a strategic level first with the framework and show you some of the things which have been blogged about quite extensively, but since we haven't really published our UI guidelines just yet, you probably could use a little refresher, and that's why I'm here. I'm going to provide you with 5 unique things that you need to think about that when you start to design and develop for Android, that makes us different than other platforms. The first thing is multitasking with background processing. In the example that I'm about to show you, which is very fast, pay close attention to how in Android I can be doing one task, but then quickly switch and take action on data as it enters my view. It's really powerful. I'll walk you through this. So here, I'm browsing in YouTube. and I'm deciding what I want to watch. Well, look at what happens. Through the notification tray, or window shade, I get a message. And I'm immediately able to act on that and go directly to Google Talk. Even more powerful, my friend has sent me a link. So I can hook from that link, I can go right to the browser. And I can browse and decide whether or not I'm interested in going to this location to meet up with him. Now, that wasn't as fast as I expected when I did that. But I decided that, okay, that looks good to me, and I can quickly respond to that message. Another thing to keep in mind, this is going somewhat fast, is we have a notion of a backstack in Android. So each time I want to go back to a previous activity, which is, for example, GChat or YouTube, I can hit the back button. Now, what was also kind of important, which you probably may have not seen, is that the data was held in a stateful place each time I went back. So multitasking, background processing, first key differentiator for us, that as a developer, you should probably think about how you're going to hold that data, but also, again, another key point, how to allow people to act on data. We'll talk more about that. The other key thing that was exposed in that demo was the idea that we have on Android, which is very unique, which is notifications. There's two types of notifications in the Android framework. There's ongoing and event-driven. Ongoing notifications are very temporal. They last a short time. They're meant to indicate progress. For example, what happens when I download an app? Well, as a user, I can flick down that window shade, and I can see the progress indication as to how long it's taking that app to download. Once it's downloaded, that notification switches into, that's an ongoing notification, that switches into the one-time event notification, where I can then act on it. One-time notifications are things like email and SMS, so that a user can quickly tap and go to the application that has presented them. On Android, what's really important is to be a good citizen with notifications. Because you can surface notifications to a user, doesn't mean you should abuse it. So, we've seen some bad examples, but we're hoping that this talk will help you better understand how to use the power of this. And the reason why I mention this is that you want to see good ratings and comments in the market when you develop an app. You spend a lot of time on that, so not abusing the framework with notifications is probably a good way to promote that. Now, another new thing with Cupcake, if you've read the blog post, is we are now allowing data to come out of applications and sit on the desktop. We have implemented widgets and live folders in Cupcake 1.5. And what this means is, as a user of an application, I can long press on the home screen, and we'll see an example of this, and drag and drop and put a widget on the desktop that exposes data at a glance. One of our reference apps is the calendar, which is pretty powerful because I can see my schedule on a daily basis, and if I decide that I want to actually go into the calendar, all I have to do is tap that widget, and I'm taken directly into the calendar. The other key component of data that we've been able to surface on the desktop in a dynamic way uses live folders. And live folders allow you, the developer, to take a dynamic subset of data, for example, maybe a group of contacts or whatnot, and put that in a folder, and that list will automatically update for the user. So when he or she selects that folder from the desktop, it's pretty actionable. It's always updated, and it's actionable. Here's an example of live folders and widgets. Again, pressing the home screen triggers a menu. I decide which widget I want, calendar in this case. And then I can go into the calendar, and I have a pretty light schedule today. Isn't that nice? And I can decide what I want to do there. I can always hit back, and I'm back to the home screen. So here's live folders. These are what we ship with. We're already seeing more live folders get created as application developers like yourselves get hold of this code. And I can browse my contacts list and then quickly go into a contact card, all from the desktop without having to go into the application. So very powerful. Again, the theme of acting on data from the desktop. Now, as many of you may know, with Android, it's not about applications. And let me rephrase that. It's about activities that you then layer tasks into, and then on top of that, you can hook in intents. And intents make it possible so that you can basically, if there's an intent over here that's share, for example, but you're over here, you can take that intent and hook it into your application so that you didn't have to build that, you're reusing it, but you're making the user experience much more powerful for the user. We're going to look at two examples in the camera and the browser as to how we utilize share intents, or intents in general, but we're going to look at the share intent specifically. So this is a really fast example. I'm going to let it play, and we'll see what happens. Basically, I'm in the camera, and I take a picture. Afterwards, I decide, using the thumbnail viewer, that I want to share it. Once I hit the share button from our on-screen action menu, I have a choice of menu options with that share intent dialog. We ship with some predefined default intents for the user, but you can, as a third party, this is what I think you guys will be interested in, is any third party can hook into that share intent. So, while I could have sent that picture through the messaging app, Pixay was also in my third-party intent because I had downloaded the Pixay application from the market. And what that left me with was the opportunity to basically cartoon up my image before I shared it with a friend. So that's a pretty good example of how we use the share intent in the camera. But what about the browser? Well, it's highly likely when I'm browsing a web page that at some point I'm going to want to share content with someone. So in this instance, I can long press on an image and then bring up the contextual menu. There, I can share that link through the share intent dialog. Again, type in a message and send it off to a friend, and then return back to my previous activity, which is really powerful. So again, intent's a good thing. That leads us to this point in the presentation. Most platforms are all about a simple linear path. You go into and out of applications. As you can probably tell by now, when you start to think about designing and developing for Android, we think more in terms of a stream. So this is the model that you should probably start to think about instead of this model, a straight line. Because with the stream, you can basically hook in intents and then allow the user to pivot on data. And that's really what we want as a user anyway, is to be able to quickly use the multitasking techniques and act on data that interest us, rather than having to stay siloed and go into and out of things. So here's an example of how I can do that in the browser again. As quickly I was browsing the Star Trek. I was browsing for Star Trek. I decided that I wanted to view that in YouTube. I had two choices. I could have continued that activity through the browser or the YouTube client app. I chose YouTube because I prefer that app. And in YouTube, through the main menu button, I was able to trigger the share intent. I triggered the main menu, and I was able to trigger the share intent by selecting that function. I could share that. I shared that video. I can share that video with a friend, and then I jump right back to the browser. So again, with Android, it's a stream as opposed to a linear flow. And that's really powerful when you start to think about how you can leverage that as well. Now, I'm going to step back, as I said previously. Those are like the high-level things that we tend to think about, and we know we tend to think about as designers on Android. But at a basic level, Android is really about making the software and the hardware come together. So you can't have a good user experience if you don't do that. And the way that we've tried to do that, this is our second representation of an Android device, is the Vodafone HTC device that we shipped in Europe recently. And how we do that, I'm going to walk you through some of the things that are associated with that right now. We have hard key buttons, basically. We have home still, which always takes you home. And we also have the notion of a long press on these buttons. So if you long press on home, I think several of you have gotten this phone right now at the keynote this morning. If you long press on that, you can quickly see a task switcher will come up. So the hard keys aid navigation. They're also meant to be doors into greater functionality, which we'll soon see with the next button, which is the menu button. The menu button is the way that you can surface more content on the screen by minimizing on-screen buttons, basically, because we have a menu that serves as the global function it serves as the place to put those global functions, rather. We have a trackball for fine focusable navigation because this isn't always that good when you want to hit a web link. We have a back stack, which is a technical thing, but that back button is really powerful because no matter where I am inside of an application, I can always jump back one step. And as I showed you in some of the examples, what's important about that is that you hold the state that the data was in for the user, so it doesn't reload. And that's really powerful. We added a search button to make it fast to search, and we still have our send and end keys. Send calls, it lets the user call. It also takes you to the call log. And end will either end the call or, if you long press on that, give you a fast way to go into airplane mode, for example. And this is a touchscreen device, mainly portrait, which means we have an on-screen keyboard. Now, previous to this, I think many of you hopefully purchased this product. It's the G1. And what this device represents is the classic QWERTY slider. The reason why I put this up is that you have to call attention to the fact that you shouldn't forget, just because now we have this great portrait device, that landscape exists in layouts. We turn landscape off in the HTC Magic on the home screen, but it's not off in other views of your application. For example, if I rotate in Gmail, it will go into landscape mode. So as a developer, it's important not to overlook landscape. In the screenshot that I'm showing on the left-hand side of the screen here, Amazon did a really nice job in considering what to do when the device opens in landscape view. You can see that they had 4 buttons in portrait that looked and fit really nicely. They were easy to touch. But what happens when we open up that slider? Well, they actually chose to do a 2x2, which kept everything above fold. The key point I'm trying to make here is that when we open up to landscape, we get a greater width, but we reduce the height. And this will be really important for you to think about when you design widgets. Anyone who's read my widget guidelines on the blog, from the blog post, will identify with that point. You lose a great deal of real estate in landscape mode. And another point that our engineers wanted to make today, which I'm happy to make to you, is that 99% of our layouts in the SDK support landscape. So you should be okay. Here's another example just to drive home the point of what happens when you go into landscape mode. On the left-hand side of the screen, we're looking at the browser bookmarks. Now, I can easily access 5 bookmarks in portrait. It's great, no problem. As soon as I go to landscape, I'm down to 2. So just a visual cue to show you guys what happens with landscape, which you probably already know, but I thought I'd just go through one more time. Now, this is a really big thing to think about in terms of the basics when designing for Android. Focus in menus. Because we support both touch and trackball navigation, there's really not a notion of focus on screen. Let me play an example for you to illustrate what this means. Here I'm browsing in touch. In touch mode, there is no focus. However, when I flick and go use the trackball, focus appears on screen. As a designer and developer for Android, just make sure you never show focus. There's a great blog post about touch mode that's been written. I highly suggest you take a look at that in case you haven't seen it already. And then when I hit the main menu, there is no focus on that until I either press with my finger or trackball select. Now, I just exposed you to the main menu, and I've kind of touched on that in some of the examples. And I may be moving a little fast, so hopefully I can slow it down. But the main menu, in terms of structure, it implies a great deal of structure. As a developer or designer for Android, the way you should think about the main menu is that it is comprised of global functions. We can comfortably fit up to 6 items on screen. However, if 6 items in the main menu. However, if you have more than 6, we suggest you use the More button, which means you get 5, as you can see over here, 5 plus 1 on the right-hand side of the screen. Another thing to keep in mind with the main menu at a high level is that it allows you to act on that list. So in Gmail, for example, we have 7 list items. When I select one, which is the 5th one, and I want to view that conversation, those global functions that were on the home screen actually don't carry over. There's global functions that carry over into the item that you've selected that relate to that conversation. So key thing to keep in mind, implied structure with menus, 5 plus 2, and also something else about main menus that you may not know is that we order them in terms of importance, rather, from left to right. So if you look across our applications, we generally put refresh in either the first or second slot across our apps. That helps with muscle memory. And this is something you guys should keep in mind. Now, if we have this global function called the main menu, how do we pivot and act on contextual items? Well, as many of you may know, we have the notion of long press. So I can be browsing a list, for example, contacts, and then I can press and hold, or trackball press and hold, and then that will trigger a long press menu. Now that long press menu, which played very fast, so we'll do that again, that long press menu has an implied structure as well. At the top of that long press menu is the most relevant contextual action to the item that you've selected. So when you're browsing the contact list, normally when you tap that person's name, you're going to go to the contact card. If you long press to get additional functions related to that person, you still have the first option to go to that contact card. So that's our structure with long press menus. So now we have global and contextual menus. And we'll also show you an example here of what to do with that more menu. So as I mentioned before, when you have more than, we can fit 6 comfortably. When you have more, we ask you to put the rest of those functions that are not primary into the more menu button. And here, for example, in Google Talk, I hit the more menu, and then I have not that many options, but I have a settings. That's where I chose to put settings. And I let the user act on that, and they can hit the back button at any time to go back to the previous screen. Now, these are pretty good basic concepts, and I also wanted to give you an example today of what we think as a team the limit is in the list view framework structure for displaying data and information. There's a lot of density that exists in Gmail, and this is a view of how you can use the structure to your advantage. We have a 3-column layout here that allows us to put checkboxes on the screen, which you'll soon see in behavior trigger a mode. We have the conversation list view, which you can tap on or, again, long press and have contextually related items to that list view button element. And then we have the notion of the star, where a user can assign importance. Now, the other thing that's implied in the framework structure that you should think about, this kind of blends into behavior, and you can tell that it's very interrelated in terms of how design works. But as a developer, you should think about the notion of read or unread. So you can show a user whether or not something has been read with white on black, bold text on white, or if it's been read, it's on gray, and it's regular text. So a lot's going on in structure. And a couple of key points which I talked about today are when you're thinking about designing and developing for Android, think about speed and simplicity. Minimize your on-screen actions. Use the main menu. Also, keep your hierarchy as flat as possible. What I showed you in that previous example calls out, there's a lot of dense information, but I didn't have to dig too deep to figure out what to do on that screen. The other thing in some of the examples that I noted was the idea of a lazy load. What we want to do on Android for the user is to progressively load in data. It gives the perception of speed, and it's pretty powerful stuff when you do it like that, rather than waiting for the whole page to load. Because someone might just get bored and decide to use the back button or get out of your application completely. So not a good thing. And then the other big thing to keep in mind is activity streams. Make sure your activities and tasks layer in or hook in intents. It'll make the user experience much more powerful, and they'll give you, again, greater flexibility. You don't have to design or develop everything because you can take advantage of it from other parts of the framework. Okay, the second pillar of the Android user experience, behavior. Here's how we're actually going to bring that structure to life. And what does that mean? Well, let's take a look at an example in Gmail again. So, as I mentioned, we had those checkboxes which you could trigger a mode. Besides going into a conversation and looking at that directly, which is what we had in 1.0, we've implemented a new behavior that when you select a checkbox, you can see that up from the bottom comes a bar. And that bar allows you to archive, label, or delete. That's a behavior, an animated behavior, that signifies that we're in a multitasking mode. As a user, I can now triage my inbox. I still have another behavior to talk about in that we show a toast. So that toast tells you a very quick confirmation that, oh, I have in fact deleted that. So we layered in behaviors, and that brought that structure to life. Another example of behaviors, and actually I downloaded an app this morning that I wanted to call out that you guys should all download. It's a Google I/O calendar for Android. It uses expandable lists, and that allows the developers, much like it allowed us in the browser history view here, to compress a lot of information into one list view button element, and then you can expand that depending on how much you wanted to view at one time. Because, if you look at the browser, for example, there's going to be a ton of bookmarks in your history, so that could go forever, and you could be scrolling endlessly. If you use an expandable list behavior, you can compress that information in a way that a user could actually digest. So here's just another element of a behavior that you might want to consider when you've built a structure with an expandable list. This is my favorite behavior that we have in the system, or one of my favorites, and that is the ability for direct manipulation of a list through drag and drop. In the music player example that you see here, I'm able to reorder my playlist, and it's really powerful. The other thing that this example kind of highlights again is the notion of expression. The way that I know as a user, the hint for me is that little icon on the left. That was my hint to drag and drop. So that's a cool behavior you can take advantage of as well in terms of when you're looking at a list view structure, our structure for lists. Another point, though, to make about behaviors is it's not always going to work out perfectly. In the example on the right with the browser bookmarks, we didn't allow for direct manipulation, and we heard about it. It's not a great idea. So we plan on changing that in the next release. As much as we think we know what we're doing, sometimes we don't. And you guys as developers are going to have to try out behaviors too, because generally, even though you can pick these out of the API demos, they may not work for a user. So what you should do is implement them and get some quick feedback when possible. Now, for anyone that's used our system, we have the notion of a toast. A toast is a tooltip in Android. And the point I want to make about a toast is that it's meant to be used when a user actually has their attention on the screen. Otherwise, they're going to miss it. We found a lot of good data that shows if something is going to be harmful for the user, it's probably better to use a dialogue at this point. If you use our new Gmail, we ship with the dialogue on for delete. Delete confirmation on as a dialogue in Gmail. We don't ship with, you can turn that off and then you'll get toast all day, which is fine, but if it's going to harm a user, don't use a toast, is the point I'm trying to make. Now, you saw some pretty basic behaviors. Checkboxes bring things up, it's obvious stuff. And you can drag and drop a list, that's awesome, but it's pretty expected that once you pick that up, it's going to perform the action that you want it to take as a user. We have the notion of delight as designers. And in Android, you can utilize some of the behaviors that I talked about, especially the long press behavior, to create unexpected delight. I jumped ahead again. Well, I'll get to that one. But this one is really cool because we have this unexpected delight that occurs when you use animation that I wanted to highlight. So here I'm going to shake things up, I guess. And I'm going to show an example of what Loop did. They layered in behaviors. So here is a classic shake animation that doesn't make me feel bad. It's fun. It's cute. And I actually want to keep making mistakes, frankly. You know. And you'll notice that they took the time to build behaviors so that it enhanced the user experience, and it actually fits their brand pretty well. They're fun to begin with. And they didn't just have to put up, hey, you know, a red error message and say, you know, type that again. They chose to do something really fun. So these are things that, as you start to get your head around how to use behaviors, that you should think about. Now, the other unexpected delight that I was thinking when I saw that video was when you long press on album art in the browser for us, we have this really cool ability to surface for the user the ability to go to Amazon, MP3, to either buy songs or purchase the album directly. You can go to the browser. Here, I'll play that again. You can go to the browser to search more for that artist, or you can go to YouTube to probably watch their videos. And that's not expected. In fact, I would probably say it's a little too hidden, but these are things that as a developer, if you know, maybe you have a little icon and that would indicate a hint for the user, and we'll get to that in expression again, how you can surface behaviors better than a user and create unexpected delight. Okay, I'm moving way too fast today. But the third pillar of expression that I want to talk about is probably the hardest one to discuss in front of a large group, and that is that this represents, if you think about structure and behavior representing 80% of your work, that is, you know, you've done the heavy lifting, the code's in place, you've picked your behaviors, you've hopefully got things running, and maybe you've gotten some feedback. Expression is going to be the next 20% of the time you spend building your app. And why is that? Because in the expression pillar, you're going to have to focus on the details. As one of the best example I can give you to focus on details comes from a quote from the legendary designer Charles Eames. Charles Eames said, "The details are the details. They make the product." Now, what that means is it's gut check time when you get to this layer or this pillar in the process. Hopefully, you've gotten some feedback from people. If you haven't, maybe you've been fortunate to actually sit with a designer. At that point, you have to decide as a developer, you know, how you're going to tighten up your app to create the polish that someone, when they open it, is going to, you know, think, okay, this is a really good, solid app. And the good news is, there's a couple of things that we built into the framework that can help you do this, and I'm going to go through those. The other thing to keep in mind, though, with expression is that it serves a function not just as an aesthetic, because, you know, when you look at the new Google Talk, you can see that the padding and the margins are really good, and it's really you feel like, okay, that's a very polished app. But you also know as a user that using the elements of expression with the text field and the buttons, that I know that I can tap that text field and change my status message. I can also hit the button and change presence. Now, there's another layer, though, beyond the polish that exists with this. Can someone tell me what's on screen in that list view that seems out of place or just the geeky Android, yes, correct. And what do you think that means? Okay, well, they're on an Android phone, but yes. And what that tells you as a user, though, is that not only, what that tells you is it's not just a cute element, but this person is probably, even though she seems to be available, I can tell by her status message and that icon that she may not immediately be able to get back to me. So you can use expression in a way that gives user actionable information. So, as I mentioned before, the API demos are a really good place to start to build your toolkit. We have structural elements in there like lists and expandable lists. We have behavior elements as well. We have dialogues. We have spinners, which are drop-down menus. We have toasts. And we also have animation. Again, there's a really good talk today from David Sparks about the Android Media Framework, which I want to pitch, that you guys should definitely check out, because he'll help you with all that. We also have a couple of tools which can help you tighten up your app. And one of them is the 9-patch tool. The 9-patch tool is really awesome. And as a designer, I can explain it to you as a designer and not a developer. But basically, what that is it allows me to create scalable assets. And an asset is a piece of artwork that can have a gradient or not. But basically, what happens is, as a designer, you create your button element or whatnot, and you compress that to its smallest state, both in terms of width and height, and then you place it in this tool, which you can download from our SDK reference toolkit. And then once it's inside there, you see little black tick marks. Now, it took me months to figure out how to use these, so I'm no expert. But once I did, the power of having this tool was awesome, because basically I could tell the developer where I wanted him to stretch the asset, both vertically and horizontally. And then I could also add in, as you see on the right-hand side, special tick marks that indicate padding. So in the magnified view, the asset stretches well vertically and horizontally, but also the padding is uniform all the way around. And that's a really big thing, because that's going to create what you just saw on the Google Talk screen, the notion of polish with someone who looks at your application. Now, what accompanies a 9-patch technique often is something we call banding, especially with gradients. When you're on a 16-bit display, it's going to happen. Now, previous to 1.5, the solution to a banding element, which it still exists in the browser, and that's an example on the left, which you really can't see, but basically a line will come across when you stretch a gradient if it hasn't been dithered. Previous to 1.5, the designer or developer had to apply a special 565 filter in the image editing program of your choice to that gradient asset. And hopefully it would dither and that it would stretch and it wouldn't have banding. The good news is that's a lot of work, by the way. The good news is in 1.5, we've created a way for you with code that you can dither in runtime. So that code snippet on the right is something I would probably use if I was a developer and I was using 9 patches. And again, why 9-patch? Because it compresses the size of the image, which reduces the overall file size of your APK. Another really cool trick and technique that you should use, because I hope everyone in this room wants to localize their app and not just, and go international and not just stay local, is the marquee event, text marquee. You can trigger a text marquee now in Cupcake 1.5, which will allow you to scroll strings. And this is really valuable when you localize, because your strings are going to get longer. So an example of this would be in the marketplace, for example. I can track, it only is triggered on trackball rollover, but then as soon as you trackball over that list view button element, you can animate a string. So you don't have to ellipsize in the standard way of ... which can't really help that many people when you, in fact, go to like Deutschland strings. Another thing that you should keep in mind in terms of expression is we've built in the use of scalable pixel units topography. And what that means is if you call large, medium, or small text appearance, this will give you the primary and secondary string colors and sizes that we use in the system framework. For example, if I look at spare parts, this is an application that's available on the market. Many of you probably have. I can quickly scale up or down my font size, but as an added bonus, what happens is margin and padding stay the same. So you basically retain the tightness and the polish that you want as a developer who's going to distribute an application to the world. Now, a final tip for expression would be, since this talk is about pixel perfect code, and if you have the fortunate circumstance to work with a designer, or you're a developer that can create a mock-up and then export a PNG file, you'll get what we call a pixel perfect layout. That pixel perfect layout can then be input into the hierarchy viewer, which is available as well for you to use. And if you use the onion skinning feature, you can make sure that all the elements on that screen line up. If you're probably going to customize, so some of those tips and tricks, while useful, may not always be useful because your designer may decide that I need to use a different text height as opposed to our standard 18 SP and 14 SP. So when that happens or different elements appear on screen and you want to check padding, use the hierarchy viewer onion skinning feature. It will help you, it'll save you time, and it'll also allow you to embrace a better focus for the details, which will make your application better. Now, there's 3 talks that will expand on everything I've covered here today. As I mentioned, there's David Sparks' introduction, or actually huge overview on the Android Media Framework, which I would attend. And then tomorrow, we have 2 developers talking, Roman Guy, who's going to talk about turbocharging your UI, as well as Joe Honorato, who will talk about supporting multiple binaries. And Joe's talk is really important because he's going to explore something we call DIP, which is device-independent pixels. And what you saw in the spare parts example is how you will be able to scale up on different resolutions and screen sizes using that technique. And Joe is going to cover that, so I would hope you would attend that as well. Now, I've been told that we are going to actually publish a blog post today, which will be the first section of our UI guidelines. So you'll have more background in what I've covered in a rapid time than just this presentation to review for how to do good Android user experience on the web. I also wanted to highlight the fact that in each SDK release, we're giving you the source artwork. So you can download, if you need a main menu icon, you can go to the source tree and download the PNG file of your choice to put into your application. In fact, we encourage you to do that. And we've also been really good and proactive lately about publishing certain user experience guidelines, such as for icons and widgets. So look forward to more of those. Okay, now I'm going to take some questions, which we have a lot of time for. Okay.
Hi.
Hi.
What's your thought about handset vendor providing Android device that does not support touch screen? Like, will there be certain feature that cannot be used, like drag and drop?
So the question is, what happens when a device is in the marketplace that can't support drag and drop? Is what it's only trackball focus?
About the future devices. Some handset vendor may create a device that does not support touch screen because touch screen is an expensive component.
So I think, and I'm not the one you should probably check out press at google.com, but in general, there's a compatibility program that exists with Android so that generally the people that are in the OHA, the device manufacturers, and everyone else has to support both touch and trackball focus. So that should not happen.
Okay. Thank you.
I have a question about context menus. I'm wondering why there is a prohibition against using icons in contextual menus.
Well, the way that you should think about that menu is it's a quick access point, so there's no reason to use an icon. It's faster to just flick a list, is how we've thought about it.
Well, except that, what you may be selecting from may not be ideally represented as text. Right? For instance, if you're doing a metronome application, you may want to have note values there. You may want to have pictures of 8th notes, 16th notes, instead of saying 8th note, 16th note, or whatever. And then, as an example.
Well, obviously it's an open source platform, and you can feel free to customize it any way you like. What we do, though, in terms of our UI, is to keep that as a contextual menu only.
Hi. It seems like modal dialogues are really frowned upon, but they're just immensely useful in some situations. Like, for instance, you want to insist on logging in before you do something, and you may have some screens where you offer a different view based on whether the user is authenticated yet or not. And most or all other major UI platforms support modal dialogues. So why is it that it's not supported on Android, or why is it that it's not convenient, and what's kind of the official way to do something in a modal fashion that really does need to be modal? Because it really simplifies logic considerably in some cases.
I don't have a good answer for you right now. I mean, we can talk afterwards.
Okay.
How's that?
Sure.
Okay.
Hi. My question is about the stream flow of activities in Android. So we could expect that different tasks will have different flows of activities, different orders, and that when you have calls of different activities that are in different applications, those are RPC calls, right, which need to have some kind of synchronization and stuff. So I was wondering whether that is likely to cause deadlocks, or if there are some suggested techniques for avoiding those kind of problems.
That's very technical. I'm just a UI guy. So
okay, sorry.
the Android fireside chat will probably be a really good place to make sure that you get that information.
Okay, sorry.
Or office hours, yeah.
Hi. I was going to ask a question. It seems like it's similar to the first question, so maybe the answer is the same. It was, how much can we rely on things like the back button being present? Because I've seen like concept phones from Germany that have no back button, also going to netbooks or some other devices. I mean, how standard is that hardware platform?
Well, if it's a Google Experience phone, that would be like something that we ship with a carrier. You're always going to have a back button.
And will there be non-Google Experience phones? Or?
I assume there may be,
All
given the fact that we're giving the software away so we can spread a better internet experience on a mobile platform.
Right.
So the thing, though, is core to the software stack is core to the software principle, and the back stack. So a back button should always be on a device.
All right.
Is the way we look at it.
Let me sneak one more thing in. Is it a fair criticism to say that long press has kind of poor discoverability? I mean, there isn't a standard icon to indicate it. I never see any visual cues. It took me a while to figure out it was there. And yet it's so useful once you get it. Do you just expect that to get into the culture over time? Or?
I don't think it's a criticism. It's just as we haven't exposed it as much as we needed to. So talks like this, and actually, we've been very busy, but publishing the guidelines will help people start to understand how to use that.
Hi. How would you go about developing an application that has a lot of options and buttons and stuff all around your UI? Would you store everything in the menu, or?
So if I can cut you off.
Sure.
So you basically want to surface on-screen actions to the user. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Right. Okay. So you as a developer need to decide what are the most important actions to put on screen. We don't say you can't, but we want you to think in terms of how you could trigger a mode with an element on screen rather than having everything up for the user. So if you look at settings, we use checkboxes in the list view preferences. We have that. But main functions, because the main menu is your basically fast track to navigation, you should put those functions in there.
Okay.
That answer your question?
Sure, yeah.
Okay.
Hi. In my work, I'm being asked to develop a lot of custom views, things like extending gadget and extending list view to have some, I guess, vendor-specific behaviors or special features. I remember in early SDK versions, there was a tool to measure frame rate, but I can't seem to find it anymore. Do you guys use anything like that?
Let me ask you, are you, you want an indicator for battery performance and stuff like that? Is that what you're hinting at?
I remember it all being part of the same tool, but there was literally a paint frame rate overlay that would
Correct me if I'm wrong, but it's spare parts, yeah.
Is it spare parts?
Yeah, spare parts has that.
Great, thanks.
Yeah, no problem. Next question.
I had a question about the back button, and I'd read somewhere where you could actually program the code to disable that if you're in an app. First of all, is that correct, and is that not recommended? If just in case you want a user to be using the application for a specific purpose, and you don't want them to like go back until they finish that particular app because of that particular function. Is that possible to do, and is that not recommended if it is?
It is possible to do,
Okay.
although I don't understand why you would want to do that for the user, because then they can't, go back to an activity.
Right.
So it's not a wise move, I don't think.
Right. That's what I was kind of thinking. I had read that somewhere, and then I guess another question was on the menu. You said y'all have customized menus available to where the PNG where you can download. Is that correct?
It's in the source tree. You should see me afterwards because it's not that easy to get to, is what I've been told. But
Okay.
we'll figure it out.
Okay. All right. Thanks.
No problem. Next.
I have a question on the performance-wise, and it's actually more of having different views within single activity versus breaking down to multiple activities, because launching different activity always takes time. And it happens that you click on some line item, and it takes 2-3 seconds to launch another activity, versus if you were doing it within a single activity by just substituting views. What are the guidelines around that of performance versus stream flow of UI that you recommend?
That's a very, I think you should talk to the office hours. Our engineers are back there. They can probably help you figure out, a fast principle to help you with that. From a UI perspective, I don't have that knowledge to help you do that.
All right, thanks.
Yep.
I have a quick question.
Sure.
I have an app that's going to require a lot of upfront configuration, but having any of that configuration in the actual GUI would be busy and not preferred. How do I go about notifying the user the first time about the complex things they have to do to set it up, but not
So we
encumbering the app?
We have a notion of setup wizards, so you can step them through each piece of functionality. When you first get a G1 or an HTC Magic, you tap the Android, and then we take you through how to use that keyboard now. So we have that, and you could help them surface it with that, and they just couldn't move on until they completed an action on screen is how I would approach that. Okay.
Hi. Do you have expectancy for some drag and drop UI development tool? And
Do we have, I didn't hear that.
some drag and drop development tool for I can create a UI with drag and drop button, something like Droid Draw, but official from Google.
I'm not, again, designer, but I would assume that in the API demos that's where you can pick up the behavior and then build upon that to help you build that app with drag and drop.
Well, no, I meant like a visual tool to actually create a UI.
Oh. No, sorry. All right. Thanks. Yeah. Okay. Oh,
Hi there.
Hey.
Quick question.
Sure.
I have an app which is going to have 3 different levels, like 3 different views for a list. And integrating back button with the on-screen back menus doesn't work very well. Because, you could switch tabs and your back would completely get ruined. Because, you want to go back in every single view that you're in rather than back between the views. Does that make sense?
Yeah, let me reiterate the question.
Okay.
So I think you're building an app that's tab-based. Is that correct? It has
So tabs are 3 different views. Let's call it 3 different views with 3 different lists with content in there.
Okay. So that's actually, in terms of the backstack, you don't go back between tabs, and you go back between the activity. So, basically the user is left with touching that, or you can trackball press it, but that's the only way to go back.
Let me give you an example. So you're in the first view, on the first tab, and you do 3 different things in there. If you're going back between each of them. But if I go to a different view after I've done the 3 things, I want to keep the back functionality within that view rather than going to the previous view, for example, or the previous list, for example.
We should talk after.
Okay.
Okay. All right. Looks like that's it. So thank you very much.